Okay. All right, so today I'm going to be talking about the Canon R6 and the R6ii. I'm going to talk about my experience using both cameras, a little bit about how I arrived with how I ended up purchasing this camera. I'm going to compare it to a lot of different cameras, where it's at in the market, etc. But it's really important to understand my perspective is as a working professional photographer, specifically an event photographer. So it will revolve around that. I am not an influencer, and I'm not a gear reviewer. In the comments right now, I'm going to try, it's a little too long, but I'm going to post everything I'll cover. And if you're not catching this live, then it will be in the description of the video. But that's everything I'm going to cover, and then I will cover some more as well. And I'm sure the direction of the conversation will go in a few different ways, depending on comments I get from people. So let's start off with how I ended up purchasing the R6 and coming from a 5D Mark III. I want to stress that I've said it consistently on this channel, you do not need the top-of-the-line best gear to do professional event photography. I actually used a 5D Mark III for 10 years, maybe a little bit more. The pandemic may have stretched its life a little bit because I wasn't really working, so I felt no need to upgrade this camera at that time, early pandemic. But it is a camera that I actually think you could use to this day. But going to an R6 and now an R6 and R6 Mark II, there's comfort in using this camera because I used it for so long, but it is inferior technology, but absolutely usable. There was a question when I first switched. I didn't quite feel like, it didn't feel the same, the R6 compared to the 5D Mark III. But having not used my 5D III now for a while, because I've had two R6s, the R6, R6ii, and picking it up for the first time today, I actually do think the R6 and R6ii are a bit more comfortable to hold and use. So my biggest concern when switching over was how would I adjust to shooting with the mirrorless camera. Forget all the advantages and specs, etc. I developed a certain way of shooting, and one big thing I do is shoot with both eyes open. And I will admit, going to digital, I did at first find it a bit jarring. There's something different about perceiving reality through a screen and then like through your actual reality. It did create like a weird short circuit in my brain that I had to get used to. I am used to it, but I do feel like it is not as natural as shooting with two eyes with the 5D Mark III. If you're curious about what the advantages of shooting with two eyes is, I did make a whole video on it. Okay, moving on. I want to talk about, I didn't care really about specs. I never really do. I really care about usability and how effective of a tool it is. And even though I love the feel of a camera, I'm only interested in its feel and its ergonomics in regards to how it allows me to effectively get the job done. Am I able to get more great images or less? That's the question. So you could have the best specs, like the big headlining specs like megapixels, shutter speed, whatever, but if the camera isn't usable or you're not able to operate the autofocus system in a very manageable way, it's not really that great for me. And I found that the R6 was an extremely usable camera, and it has one major, I felt was a game-changing feature. I had to figure it out on my own, but after getting the camera and then watching a few videos on YouTube, other people eventually, I'm not going to say eventually, I wasn't the first, I'm sure, but other people had figured out a great way to set it up, the same way I figured out how to set it up, and that is by basically using a dual button autofocus system. So what I actually did is I turned face and eye detect off with my basic back button focus, and then I programmed my asterisk to then override that. And so basically what I would do is I would set it up usually using the tiniest focus point, and I would put that wherever I want to get focus. But if there was a person in the frame, I was photographing people, which I was doing the majority, or am doing the majority of the time, I could switch to the asterisk, and then it will kick in, the auto eye and face detect will kick in. This is an incredible way of working because if you are an event photographer or a wedding photographer or anyone switching between photographing things and people, you're able to do so in a flawless way. Another option would be to turn the eye detect on and off with a button, but I like the idea of switching and having it dedicated. Now, the R6 Mark II is a little bit, it can be set up this way, but it is a little bit different, and I'll get into that when I eventually get to that camera. So I did get this about 6-7 months. Let's see, I wrote it down. The camera I think came out in July of 2020. I picked up the R6 II about, it looks like April 1st of 2021. And as I recall, March was when things really started to open up, and it was just a wonderful camera to use. Anyway, so let's fast forward a bit. I'll see if there's any questions. I'm streaming at a weird time of day, so probably not. Nope. So I recently did get an R6 Mark II. It's what I'm filming with right now. I want to talk about the differences between that and the R6. If it's a worthwhile upgrade, that will depend on you. The short version for me is that it's in my means, and it made more sense just to get the R6 Mark II. Is it a better camera? Is it a worthwhile upgrade? I absolutely do think it is, but like fundamentally, I don't think you're going to really get the results that your client would appreciate, you know, or even do I think it will make a big difference in your workflow or anything like that? Probably not. So I actually think the R6 original would be a good value for anyone. When the Sony the R4 came out, I'm sorry, the A7 IV came out, I actually thought that it was a toss-up between the R6 and that camera. I didn't think there was necessarily a clear winner, but I felt the R6 was a better buy if you're going to do event photography, at least when it comes to what I personally value. I do feel like Sony was going a little bit more for a camera that would appeal to all sorts of photographers, from amateurs to wedding photographers, whereas I feel like the R6 was a bit more specific for an event photographer, whether that's by design or not. I personally enjoyed the 20 megapixels. I like to be able to edit quickly. The longer it takes me to edit, the way I see it, the less money I make per hour, the less work I can do in a week. So it is important. It is a business decision for me. Would I like more megapixels in a perfect world without any drawbacks? Absolutely. And I'll get back to the 24 megapixels of the R6 Mark II. But I found the shooting speed advantage, and I just love the way autofocus has been implemented in this camera. As I mentioned, I don't have experience with the Sony though, and I am in no way, again, a gear reviewer or an influencer, and so I don't know everything about everything, and I don't really care. Again, my perspective is I'm a working professional event photographer. So I actually thought it was a very strong camera on the market, and the Mark II is just incredible. It is a class leader in a lot of really important ways for me. It is a class leader in shooting speed, which to me isn't that big of a deal. I actually thought the R6 original was plenty good, but the R6 Mark II now can do 40 frames a second in electronic, which is staggering. And I put it on just to test, and I left it on for a whole job, and I ended up overshooting like crazy. So it is way more than I personally need. The extra 4 megapixels, not really a big deal. I don't think anyone's going to notice. I haven't tried to notice, and my test for if something matters or not is not by pixel peeping or anything like that. The way I kind of check myself to see am I appreciating something or not is if I just naturally noticed, like, my R6 Mark II files look a bit better than my R6, and that's never happened. When I'm looking through my images, I'm never going to know which I shot with which camera. There is one feature, I think this is a big, before I get to actually this last feature, I also want to say that there's so many different little things about this camera that I've noticed are different if you go through the menus that no gear reviewer is ever going to get into, because it kind of doesn't sell. People just want to like be like, this has that many megapixels and that camera has this many megapixels. And B, there's just too much to really get into. And so you're not going to see it in a gear review video by most of these like review channels. And I'm not going to get into them all either. But there are a lot of differences that are not going to be apparent from watching YouTube videos. So the big, one of the biggest changes, and I think it's the only change on the body, would be that they moved the on-off switch to the right side of the camera, and now the movie mode is on the left side of the camera. Just gotta check. I personally do not understand that change entirely. I have a lot of questions. I'm not really sure it was needed. I think maybe I'd prefer it to be a little bit differently. I wonder a lot of things like, were they just caving in to a vocal minority? Do that many people really feel like a power on-off switch needs to be on the right side of the camera? I don't really get the argument that you want to be able to operate your camera one-handed. Like, it doesn't really make sense to me, because that means you're pulling your camera out and you're needing to turn it on with one hand, and then you're going to shoot with one hand the whole time, and that seems like a very specific situation. I'm usually pulling my camera out with two hands, even if I, for whatever reason, shoot with one hand. It's not a big deal to quickly turn the camera on. So I just don't get it, to be honest. And I feel like there may be a stronger argument. I always felt like there was a stronger argument for having the on-off switch completely out of the way, and then all the operational stuff being on one side of the camera. But that's me. I don't think it's a big deal either way. It does take me some time. It has taken me time to get used to it, but whatever. But although I think the button placement, not a big deal, I do think having that video switch is a big deal. And I never really cared, and this is coming from someone who like does film stuff. I just didn't think it was a big deal until I went on my trip last year to Thailand, where I'm kind of really honestly a bit over photography in my personal life. It's become my work, and I'm not very inspired right now. But it was a family trip, and I did promise to take photos for my parents, and I did, and I shot video for myself. And so when I went to some really cool places like Angkor Wat, I wanted to both shoot photos and video, and I didn't have the Mark II yet. I did it with the original, and switching every time, it just didn't work out super well. It was a pain. And I haven't figured out if there's a way, but I shot a lot of slow motion video. I would like a quick way to do that. I haven't looked into figuring out how to do that yet. Okay, I'm gonna see if there are any questions. Embarrassingly, I don't think there will be. And there aren't. Okay, so let's talk about autofocus. Now this has been a very frustrating thing for me, because while it does inherit a new autofocus system, I find that Canon is not very good at explaining in pretty much anywhere how to get the most out of it. I did a deep dive, and I just couldn't really get my questions answered anywhere on the internet, whether it was from the user manual, other YouTubers, or even interviews with the Canon USA rep, Rudy, whoever that is. I just feel like there's another issue, and that is that they maybe need to hire someone. It's not just an issue of translations. I think it's an issue of engineers writing the program, and they need people that like get people, perhaps. And Canon kind of knows it, I think. So for example, they have changed a few names. Like they used to call when the camera would continuously track your subject, I mean without pressing anything, it would just do it without back button focus or pressing your shutter halfway. They used to call that continuous, which was confusing because other brands call their servo mode continuous, but it goes beyond that. and I just haven't really gotten a lot of answers. So this is where I settled in setting up my own R6 Mark II versus my R6. So like I said, with the R6, I basically programmed two different buttons. One will just be like a, it is servo, but it is whatever the shape of the focus point is, like that's what it will focus on. I would use the small one. I'd put it on detail shots. I'd focus exactly where I'd want it to be focused on. And then I programmed the asterisk to then override that, and wherever I put it, it would focus on an eye. Now the cool thing is, let's say you're focusing right here, it would just track to the closest eye. Eventually I realized I photographed people far more than things, and I switched those buttons because I felt it would be more comfortable to have my thumb on the back button focus more often than the asterisk. Now with the Mark II, they changed things, and it works a little bit differently. So now pretty much you can turn the tracking on for any mode, and you can have eye detect or face detect on. You also have more features that I'm not going to get into as far as what it will track and that kind of thing. But I found that if you set it up, it did a few things that if you set it up the way I set up the original R6, if you set it up that way, you lost a few interesting features it seemed to do, but it was never really explaining. For example, it would have a little indication of which eye would be tracked if you did do eye tracking. And by setting it up the way I had the R6, I kind of lost that feature, and so I just honestly, you can probably see I'm flustered because I feel like no matter what, I'm not getting the most out of the camera, because right now I have it where, but I do have it on the tracking anytime. I have it on depending on whatever. I can set my focus point to any size I want, whatever I'm using, it will track an eye. However, sometimes what I did is I programmed it's like the opposite. I programmed the other button, the asterisk, to then override that and do just like no eye detect, and just like whatever I'm on, it will track. But it's doing something where it will still try to do like subject detection, and I haven't figured out how to turn that off. And so what that means is I'm really picky about, like, if I'm photographing a detail shot, you know, like let's say there's a detail shape of my hand or something, and like I really want to photograph here, not here. Like it matters to me, and I'm not able to do that because it starts tracking the subject. In the end, like that won't matter if you're shooting at like f4, but if I'm shooting a detail at like 1.2, it becomes an issue. I haven't figured that out fully, and I have spent a lot of time on it, and that's been really frustrating. Okay, moving on. We've got a couple of comments. Ruth asked if I use the back screen. No, because I very much like to be fully engulfed in the image. I never do that. I noticed younger people, or people that started photography more recently, they do that when I teach. My students try to hold their camera like that, and I feel like there are some differences. I do think that's not the right way to hold a camera for good reasons, but I don't think there's anything bad about looking at the screen. And I know that's not what you're asking. You're asking about using it to select your focus point. No, I like the joystick. I would probably use that screen if I didn't have a joystick. I have experimented with it. It works. I don't like that, you know, my nose can change my focus point, that kind of thing. Yeah, I understood what you meant, Ruth. So let's talk about, I already talked about the R6 versus the A7. I already thought that was a very competitive camera. I personally, this is my opinion, and my perspective is as an event photographer, and I believe there is great gear amongst all brands, but I do think the R6 Mark II is the absolute best camera on the market for event photography. That is my opinion. It's, again, based on my perspective as an event photographer, looking at the specs, etc. But you may value things a little bit differently. Maybe if you're a wedding photographer and you're shooting more portraits, you would enjoy having a little bit more resolution. That's possible, and then so maybe there's a better option for you amongst another brand. But I also think the R6 Mark II is also just, I actually have found myself in need of write-offs in the last 2 years, and I have almost tried, I've tried like to talk myself into buying like an R3 or an R5. And I can't do it because the R5 I actually think would be a worse camera for what I do. I don't think that, and now versus the R6 Mark II, it's actually feels a bit dated, the R5. It doesn't have Canon's most modern focusing system. It performs a little worse in low light. The files would be larger and therefore take longer to edit, to export, etc. And so I can't talk myself into it. The R3, again, I think it's just such overkill. I can't talk myself into that one either. I just think this is the right camera for me. And I think the R6s are going to be more usable if you ever want to shoot with two camera bodies. I do think, I haven't tried it, but shooting with like an R3 and an R6 or two R3s would be a little bit too cumbersome, both in weight, maybe not too much, but definitely I think just bulk. It would be a bit bulkier to do. And you can very easily shoot with two camera bodies with, especially if you're shooting with, when you're shooting with smaller bodies, it's easier. But also the Canon RF lenses are just so much lighter than like EF lenses were. They are using lighter materials. And if this was a hobbyist camera, like an old film camera, those cameras, I love heavy weight. I love things being all metal. But again, what matters more for professional work is usability, and having a very light lens matters. I talked about in my last stream how I've been experimenting with the 28-300, and I immediately picking it up at a job was like, screw this, like compared to using this lens. Now, if I was just out and about enjoying my day, not traveling, but like I was very much just shooting for fun, I'd be fine with heavy gear, but I have to cover an event. I need to be able to cover that event effectively and for many hours at a time. So for example, I just shot a conference over 5 days, 11 hours a day. There's no way I would want heavy gear for that. So one quick thing, yeah, it really does leave, I think, if you are a burst shooter, I mean, it is by far the best camera. I think it's overkill again, but like the Sony alternative only does like 10 frames a second, and that's not full-sized RAW. So I think I happily trade resolution, and I just think Sony was going for more mass appeal, and Canon went more for someone like me, and with the R6 Mark II, they kind of improved the resolution, where 24 doesn't sound as puny. Even though I don't know if you'll ever notice a difference. Okay, let me take a look at any comments. I do have to go teach an in-person photography class today, so I don't have too much time. Let's see. If you want to be lightweight and not carry a lot of lenses with you, which lenses would you use for an event? The 28-70 2.0 is not an option. Well, it's I mean, if you want one lens that can kind of do everything and shoot in low light, that's not bad. I'm curious about it because I'm at a point, and again, I wasn't at this point most of my career, where I need to spend for tax purposes. It's in my means, but for most of my career, and I always will have this, I know how hard it is to be successful at this, and I know that upgrading gear, switching brands, it's not an option for most actual working photographers unless they're fueling their photography business in quotes, because they might not be making money at it. So unless they're fueling their business with a full-time job that pays like 6 figures, it's not really realistic that you're going to be upgrading too often. But I have thought about getting maybe like the 28-70, because I have the EF 24-70 original version, and I think my particular copy is soft. I've never liked it. I barely use it now. I actually have found that I can do what I mostly would use that for with the 50. I find that I've memorized my focal length, that 50mm focal length, so well that I kind of just know where to position myself to kind of get most shots with it. So if I had to shoot just an event with one lens, I would probably just choose that 50. So you're asking about lighter gear. Another option I've found has worked really well is like my 50 for just about everything. This is an event that won't have any speakers on stage. That's a situation you definitely want, like a 70 to 200. But I have found that shooting with the 50 on one camera body, and then like not my 17 to 40 or 24 to 70, but I'll actually put that RF 16 millimeter on that other body, and it's almost like carrying no second body at all. It is so light. I think it does a great job. I find I'm usually using like a 17 to 40 at 17 millimeters anyway, so just why carry all that weight? And also with the 16 millimeters, I do get an f2.8 maximum aperture, which is far better than f4. That said, it is not a professional lens. It is an overachiever and looks great for its price. It is really an overachiever. I would strongly recommend that lens if it's in your means, or even if you have, maybe you don't have enough to buy a 17 to 40 or 15 to 35, whatever. You could do that for now. There are going to be times you might want that 17 to 40 or something like it, but you could do it, or if you have it, you could also buy it if you just are looking to reduce weight and have other options like I've done. It depends on the job. Sometimes you're going to be at a job, maybe it's outdoors, there's no safe place to put your bag, and you want everything you're going to use on your person, then maybe it would be a good lens. Other jobs are like one room. Someone asked me in a YouTube comment today about like what I bring and how to reduce weight. Often I bring everything, and I do that because it's just easier to grab my camera bag that had everything in it, and just, it's heavy, yeah, but I lug it to the job, I plop it in a corner, everything's there. It just depends on the job. Colin, what are the advantages and disadvantages of a two-camera system? Okay, there's a delay, so I'm going to answer two different questions because I'm not 100% sure what you mean. Do you mean carrying two camera bodies or a two-camera system? Because I am going to answer both. Pros and cons, two bodies, I mean, it's just a comfort thing. Like, you might not be comfortable shooting with two bodies. I'm not super comfortable with it. I love having one camera and just operating that camera and being completely focused, like dialed into that focal length even. Like, my favorite thing to do is to cover an event with just one lens, like my 50. I love that. I get into the zone. I know exactly where I need to be, position myself to get the shot I want. But with two camera bodies, you don't have to change lenses. Sometimes you're going to need to change lenses, meaning shot to shot. So it depends on the format, where maybe you're photographing someone on stage, but you need wide shots of a crowd simultaneously. But kind of like open format events, meaning there's no real structure, you just show up and get coverage, you could do something like one camera body, you shoot with like a 50 millimeter, you shoot with a 50 millimeter for 20 minutes, you switch, you shoot with a 16 millimeter for 20 minutes, you then get like a telephoto and do like close-up candids, that kind of thing. Now, two-body system, meaning like, what if you're shooting with an R6 and the 5D Mark III? That was really annoying. I'm not gonna lie. Like, I never thought it would be as annoying as it was. It's become it was like much more annoying than it needed to be, because I'd favor one body. Sometimes like I would have one lens on like my 5D, but I wanted to shoot with the R6, and then I'd just switch it over because I favored the R6. I needed an adapter for every lens. Sometimes I had the adapter on an EF lens and I wanted to put it on my 5D3, and so I had to take the adapter off. And so it added a step that was very frustrating because, again, my ultimate focus is like, when it comes to gear, is how effective I can be as an event photographer. So I did not care for that. And even now, I'm kind of like annoyed by having the R6 and R6 Mark II. You know, I have the privilege of being annoyed after working extremely hard for a very long time. I feel like now, like I have the privilege of being annoyed, where I'm like mildly contemplating getting rid of my R6 and then getting an R6 Mark II. You know, I do work enough. Put enough hours into it. It's kind of like you need to love the car you drive if you live in Los Angeles because you're in it so much. You know, I use my camera so much, I need to love the experience. And I am finding that the subtle differences between the R6 and R6 Mark II are almost enough for me to want to get a second R6 Mark II, but I probably won't. Probably won't. I don't know. Another comment, if you ever have time to do a video on how you handle those open events, I would be glad. I mainly photograph big music festivals, which last 4 days, and sometimes I don't know which shots I'm lacking. Well, I can just quickly answer. I typically do, like I said, I do like 10, 15, let's say you're there 2 hours only. It doesn't matter what gear you bring, and it doesn't matter what focal lengths you're going to shoot in. What matters is that you're covering the event and telling a story, and that's why you use a variety of shot types. Now, establishing shots does not mean you necessarily need a wide lens if you're able to back up and get a shot of everything, right? If you're able to like get on a hill and shoot down below with a telephoto and capture the whole event, well, you have an establishing shot. It's more about just telling a story with a variety of images, and that would be your establishing shot, your detail shots, your close candids, your candid interactions, the ones that show some context, so over the shoulder shots, that kind of thing. So yeah, I do like 15, 20 minutes. I follow the flow, like whatever I creatively feel like doing. I don't set a timer. If you feel like you're missing stuff, you might want to set a timer. You could experiment with that where you go, okay, for the next 15, 20 minutes, I'm gonna shoot with this, like that lens. I think if I am lacking in any focal length, it would be wider focal lengths. So like that is something I've been enjoying doing, is like specifically giving myself time to focus on that. And also when you focus on one thing, that's how you can really improve at it as well. Have I ever done event photography in other countries? No. I've worked in other countries, but no, not event photography. Okay, I'm gonna check my notes. I think that kind of does it. Those are my thoughts. If a question comes in as I'm wrapping up, I'll answer it. But other than that, I hope you enjoyed it. I really don't think I have any other thoughts. I'm really happy with this gear. Okay, I got a question. Are you a fan of 85 millimeters? Yeah, I used to use 85 a lot more, but ever since I got the RF50, I find like that's so versatile. I really favor it. And while an 85 could be interesting, I just feel like it's like extra. Like even shooting with like the 135 or the 70 to 200 at 200 millimeters at, let's say, cocktail hour style events, I just don't need it. I can get everything I need with the 50, and that's kind of been the kick I've been on for a while. But you know, I do have an 85. I have used it for events. It wasn't super fast to focus, but it was a 1.8 lens at a time in which that was the quickest lens I had. I used it a lot. And it is good to have something you can shoot portraits with as well, because event photography, there are going to be times you need to shoot a portrait. We aren't portrait photographers, but there are times you'll have to shoot a portrait, or maybe you're going to integrate, like I have, a portrait photography service at an event. So I have one of those this month, in which I'll be setting up like a headshot station and shooting the event. So I'll have someone helping me out. I'll probably shoot the majority of both, but I'll have a second person so I can actually cover the event and the headshot booth. Okay, another question. How much of your work on location is impressing the client to provide a better experience while you are there? I'm not sure what you mean by that. Do you mean like how much time am I managing my client versus actually shooting? I'm not sure. But if you clarify, I'll answer. If not, I'll have to circle back later in a comment. All right, that's going to be it for me, I think, because I actually have to get ready for a job. Thanks for watching. I will have, eventually, when I'm able, I will have non-live content, but I'm finding just shooting live content is easier for me. It's just like showing up to an event. I did some prep, but mostly I just have to kind of improvise it. And that works a lot better for me than having to like plan and edit a video. And then Colin says, how you act and mannerisms so they are impressed with professionalism. Yeah, I mean, that is important. And one thing I've noticed, when you get really good and you start, and you just know the job so well, it starts to show. And before people see the images, they'll know how good you are. So I will get people come up to me and be like, man, your coverage is incredible, because they're watching me work. They can just tell I know what I'm doing. I know the job. That goes a long way before people even see the images. And of course, conduct yourself professionally. People care. People care about who they're hiring. They want you to be someone they enjoy working with. That's important. And so if you're not likable, I would work on it. Is using flash on longer focal lengths possible? Yeah, absolutely. There's no difference really. It's not going to be relevant. Unless we're talking about like using a direct flash without bouncing it off a wall and you're using a telephoto. That's different, but that's not going to be the case. And then Adam clarified like 105 millimeters plus, no issues. All right, that's it for today. Thanks for watching. If you want some mentoring, extra content, and more, check out my Patreon page. I appreciate all of you. Thank you.